Imagine standing outside in brutal cold, the kind that cuts through bone and silences cities, and realizing that your expensive modern jacket, stuffed with branding, synthetic insulation, and promises of advanced technology, is failing you, while 800 years ago people survived, worked, traveled, and even thrived in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with nothing more than wool, leather, linen, and an understanding of nature that we seem to have forgotten, because medieval clothing was not fashion, it was not seasonal trendwear, and it was not designed to look good under artificial lights. It was a survival system forged through centuries of exposure to real cold, real wind, real moisture, and real consequences, whereas your $300 jacket is a consumer product optimized for marketing photos, urban commuting, and controlled discomfort, not true environmental extremes. Medieval people understood something modern design often ignores. Cold itself is not the main enemy. Moisture is, because the moment sweat builds up and cannot escape, heat loss accelerates and the body begins to fail, which is why medieval clothing systems began with breathable base layers made of linen or fine wool that wicked moisture away from the skin, instead of trapping it like polyester does, followed by multiple adjustable layers of thick wool that trapped warm air while still allowing ventilation, because wool is a natural miracle fiber that retains insulating properties even when damp, something most synthetic materials simply cannot do, and instead of a single all-in-one jacket, medieval clothing was modular, adaptable, and responsive to activity level, allowing layers to be added or removed depending on movement, labor, wind, and temperature. While modern jackets are static solutions pretending to be universal answers, medieval cloaks and coats were cut wide and flowing, not slim and body-hugging, because they understood that warmth comes from trapped air, not compression, whereas modern slim-fit designs often destroy the body's natural insulation by squeezing layers together and eliminating air pockets. And medieval outer garments frequently incorporated fur, felt, and thick leather, not as luxury items but as wind-blocking barriers, because wind, not temperature alone, is what strips heat from the body fastest. Yet modern jackets hide behind vague labels like wind-resistant that collapse the moment true Arctic wind is encountered. Footwear followed the same logic, with thick leather soles, wool linings, and layered socks designed to break contact with frozen ground and prevent thermal bridging, while modern rubber soles often conduct cold upward despite their sleek appearance. Medieval people also understood movement as part of warmth. Clothing was designed for walking, labor, farming, chopping wood, and riding, all of which generate body heat that the garments were meant to conserve intelligently. Whereas modern life minimizes movement and then expects static insulation to compensate, a losing equation. In extreme cold, head and neck coverage were never optional in medieval cold weather systems, because they knew a massive percentage of body heat escapes through the head and collar area, which is why hoods, cowls, and layered scarves were standard, not accessories, while modern jackets often prioritize aesthetics over sealing these critical heat loss zones. Gloves and mittens were layered as well, often favoring mittens because shared finger space retains heat better than separated fingers, a principle ignored by many modern designs focused on dexterity over survival. Perhaps most importantly, medieval clothing was local. Materials were sourced from the surrounding environment and refined over generations to suit specific climates, unlike today's globalized jacket designs that attempt to function identically in New York, Norway, and Dubai, an absurd assumption that ignores regional weather realities. Medieval garments were built to be repaired, reinforced, and used for decades, which meant craftsmanship and material integrity mattered, whereas modern jackets are victims of planned obsolescence, losing insulation, stitching, and structure after a few seasons to push the next purchase. This difference reveals a deeper philosophical divide, because medieval people dressed for survival first and identity second, while modern consumers dress for image and trust branding to replace function, resulting in an illusion of progress where technology appears advanced but fails under genuine stress. When extreme cold strips away comfort and convenience, ancient principles reassert themselves. Breathability over sealing, layering over bulk, natural fibers over plastic, adaptability over rigidity. And this is why medieval clothing systems succeeded where modern jackets often fail, not because the past was superior in every way, but because its designs were shaped by consequences we no longer face daily. And the real question is not why medieval people stayed warm at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, but why, with all our data, materials, science, and engineering, We keep ignoring the lessons carved into history by survival itself, lessons that quietly remind us that nature does not care about price tags, marketing claims, or brand loyalty, and that when the temperature truly drops, it is understanding, not money, that determines whether you stay warm or freeze. And when you strip away the mythology of modern innovation, what becomes painfully obvious is that medieval clothing worked precisely because it was designed around the human body as a biological system, rather than a mannequin for consumer display. Because medieval people did not outsource responsibility for warmth to a brand or a price tag, but understood that survival in extreme cold required cooperation between fabric, movement, and environment, which is why their garments evolved slowly and ruthlessly through failure, death, and adaptation instead of quarterly product launches. And this is the part that modern marketing never wants you to think about. Medieval clothing systems were stress-tested in conditions where failure meant frostbite, immobility, or death, not discomfort during a walk from a parking lot to a heated building. So weaknesses were eliminated over generations, while modern jackets are optimized for mild cold, short exposure, and urban convenience, giving the illusion of extreme capability without actually delivering it. Medieval people understood thermal regulation intuitively, knowing that overheating was just as dangerous as freezing, which is why breathability was sacred and airtight sealing was avoided unless absolutely necessary, because trapped moisture kills warmth faster than cold air ever could. Whereas modern jackets often chase total insulation and water resistance at the cost of ventilation, turning the wearer into a condensation chamber that collapses the moment exertion begins. Medieval tailors also designed garments to work with gravity, wind direction, and posture, using overlapping layers, draped cloaks, and weighted hems that naturally sealed gaps without rigid closures. Unlike modern jackets that rely on zippers, synthetic cuffs, and tension points that fail under movement and wear, even the way medieval people dressed daily mattered, because clothing was donned gradually, layers warmed by the body before exposure, rather than thrown on cold at the last second as we do today. And this subtle ritual helped establish a stable thermal envelope before stepping into harsh conditions. The obsession with lightweight gear in modern design further exposes the problem, because medieval clothing was unapologetically heavy where it needed to be. Understanding that mass combined with air retention creates thermal stability, while modern consumers demand thinness and lightness even when physics says otherwise, forcing manufacturers to compensate with fragile synthetic fills that degrade quickly and lose effectiveness over time. Medieval cold weather systems were also holistic. Clothing, shelter, diet, and daily rhythm all worked together. People consumed high-fat, high-calorie foods in winter because they understood metabolism as heat, whereas modern life separates clothing from lifestyle and expects fabric alone to solve what is actually a systemic problem. The deeper truth is that medieval people respected winter as an adversary that could not be conquered, only negotiated with, while modern culture treats cold as an inconvenience to be hacked or bypassed, leading to designs that prioritize comfort narratives over environmental reality. This is why, when modern expeditions, reenactors, and survivalists test historical clothing replicas made with authentic materials and methods, they are often shocked to discover that these systems outperform many contemporary jackets in sustained cold, not because the past was magical, but because it was honest about limits. And this brings us to the uncomfortable conclusion that progress has not been linear, because while materials science has advanced, design philosophy has regressed, trading resilience for convenience and depth for aesthetics, leaving us dependent on fragile systems that work beautifully until they don't. Medieval clothing did not promise miracles, it promised endurance, and in a world increasingly reminded that environments still matter, that promise may be worth more than all the marketing language stitched into your $300 jacket. Because when extreme cold arrives and systems are tested beyond comfort zones, it is not novelty that keeps humans warm, but principles that have already survived centuries of winter. And the final irony is that we do not actually lack the knowledge to build clothing that works the way medieval systems did. We lack the willingness to abandon the illusion that newer automatically means better, because the medieval approach to cold was grounded in humility, in the acceptance that the human body has limits and that design must respect physics rather than attempt to override it with marketing language. Whereas modern outdoor culture often sells confidence instead of competence, encouraging people to trust gear over understanding, which quietly erodes self-reliance and replaces it with dependency on increasingly complex products that few users truly understand. Medieval people learned warmth through lived feedback. numb fingers, burning skin, fatigue, and adjusted their clothing accordingly, while modern wearers are insulated from consequence until the system suddenly fails, and when it does, the failure feels shocking because it was never framed as possible. This is why medieval clothing feels almost alien to us today, not because it is outdated, but because it demands participation from the wearer, layer management, movement, awareness, rather than passive consumption. And this demand clashes with a culture that prizes convenience above competence, yet the lesson embedded in medieval cold weather systems extends far beyond clothing, because it exposes a broader pattern in how modern society approaches technology as a substitute for understanding rather than a tool guided by it, leading to fragile systems that perform well under ideal conditions but collapse under stress. The medieval world, often dismissed as primitive, was in fact deeply pragmatic, designing solutions that accepted environmental reality instead of denying it, and that pragmatism is precisely what made its clothing effective at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, where honesty matters more than innovation, the uncomfo. Our table truth is that many modern jackets do not fail because we lack better materials, but because they are designed for a world of short exposure, controlled environments, and predictable routines, a world that disappears the moment conditions become truly hostile, revealing how thin our margin of resilience has become. Medieval clothing systems, by contrast, assumed hostility as the default and built from that assumption outward, creating redundancy, adaptability, and forgiveness for human error, qualities that modern design often sacrifices in pursuit of sleekness and speed. And perhaps this is why the idea unsettles us, because it suggests that progress is not merely about adding layers of technology, but about retaining wisdom, and that by discarding historical knowledge as obsolete, we have made ourselves more vulnerable, not less. So when we ask why medieval people stayed warm at 40 degrees Fahrenheit while modern jackets sometimes fail, we are really asking a deeper question about what kind of intelligence we value, one that looks impressive on shelves, or one that quietly works when survival is on the line. And until that question is answered honestly, history will continue to expose the gap between what we believe we've mastered and what nature is still perfectly capable of reminding us we haven't. And if this realization feels uncomfortable, it should, because it exposes how modern society has quietly trained itself to mistake complexity for capability, assuming that more layers of technology automatically translate into better outcomes, when in reality they often introduce more points of failure, something medieval clothing systems instinctively avoided by favoring simplicity, redundancy, and repairability, meaning that if one layer failed, the system did not collapse, whereas modern jackets often rely on a single critical material or construction method that, once compromised, said by moisture, compression, or wear, renders the entire garment ineffective. This difference mirrors a broader shift in how humans relate to tools, because medieval people understood their equipment intimately, knowing how it behaved in wind, snow, rain, and exhaustion, while modern users are encouraged not to understand their gear at all, only to trust it blindly, creating a dangerous gap between expectation and reality. Medieval clothing invited awareness, feeling airflow, sensing dampness, adjusting layers, while modern designs aim to numb awareness, promising constant comfort regardless of conditions, which paradoxically leaves the wearer less prepared when conditions inevitably change. Even the idea of failure has been redefined because, for medieval people, failure meant physical consequence and immediate correction, whereas today failure is often delayed, hidden, or externalized, blamed on weather, bad luck, or defective products, rather than flawed assumptions. This is why historical clothing knowledge continues to resurface in modern survival training, reenactment, and extreme environment research, not as nostalgia, but as a corrective lens that reminds us that the laws governing heat, moisture, and human physiology have not changed simply because our materials have, and that ignoring those laws carries the same cost now as it did centuries ago. Medieval clothing was not perfect, but it was honest, designed by people who expected the world to be hostile and prepared accordingly. While modern design often assumes the world will accommodate us, an assumption that collapses the moment power fails, supply chains break, or environments push beyond comfort thresholds. And perhaps the most sobering takeaway is that the medieval advantage was never technological at all, but cognitive, the willingness to observe reality, respect limits, and design within them, an approach that feels almost radical today in a culture addicted to shortcuts and abstractions. So when we compare medieval clothing to a $300 jacket and ask which performs better at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, we are not just comparing fabrics, we are comparing two worldviews, one rooted in consequence and adaptation, the other in confidence and consumption. And until the modern world relearns how to value understanding over appearance, systems over products, and resilience over convenience, history will continue to quietly outperform us every time conditions stop being forgiving. And what makes this comparison truly unsettling is that modern society is now re-entering conditions where medieval logic matters again, not because we are going back, but because our systems are becoming more fragile, energy grids strain, climate patterns grow more extreme, supply chains break, and suddenly the assumption that warmth can always be purchased, powered, or delivered collapses, revealing how dependent we have become on external systems to solve problems our ancestors handled locally and personally. Because medieval clothing was not just an object, but part of a self-sufficient ecosystem where knowledge lived in the community and failure produced learning instead of lawsuits. Modern cold-weather gear, by contrast, exists inside a web of dependency. Factories, shipping routes, synthetic materials, replacements, that works only as long as everything else works too. And the moment that web falters, the gap between appearance and function becomes dangerously clear. Medieval people prepared for winter as a certainty, not an exception, shaping habits, tools, diets, shelters, and clothing around it months in advance, while modern culture treats extreme cold as an anomaly that can be ignored until the last moment. Trusting emergency solutions to compensate for a lack of preparation, a mindset that repeatedly proves fragile when conditions overwhelm infrastructure. This difference explains why medieval clothing systems feel resilient even today. They were never designed to be impressive, only reliable. And reliability is precisely what modern design often sacrifices in pursuit of novelty and speed. There is also a psychological dimension rarely discussed, because medieval people expected discomfort and therefore managed it intelligently, whereas modern consumers expect comfort and therefore panic when it disappears, making equipment failure feel catastrophic rather than manageable. The irony is that the science used to market modern jackets often confirms medieval wisdom. Heat retention through air trapping, moisture control, wind blocking, layered insulation. Yet the execution prioritizes convenience and aesthetics over durability and adaptability, hollowing out the very principles it claims to embody. And so the lesson of medieval clothing at 40 degrees Fahrenheit is not a call to abandon modern materials or romanticize hardship, but a warning about forgetting first principles, because technology that ignores human behavior, environmental variability, and failure modes does not represent progress. It represents risk disguised as sophistication. In the end, medieval people stayed warm not because they were tougher, richer, or luckier, but because their systems assumed reality would be unforgiving. And until modern design rediscovers that assumption, history will remain an uncomfortable mirror, reminding us that survival has never belonged to the most advanced tools, but to the deepest understanding of how humans, materials, and nature actually interact when comfort is no longer guaranteed.